further debate? I recognize the member from Ottawa-Vanier.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And as always, it's always an honour to rise on behalf of the residents of Ottawa-Vanier. And this afternoon, it's to speak about the Bill 119, the Protecting Ontario Streets and Communities Act. So, at first glance, this bill contains several measures that I think many members of this House can support, because it seeks to modernize aspects of our justice system, strengthen certain protections for victims, and address a number of public safety concerns. And whenever we have the opportunity to improve public confidence in our institutions and make our communities safer, well, we should approach that work constructively and in good faith. But Bill 119 is also a reminder that legislation is only as meaningful as its implementation. Good intentions do not automatically translate into better outcomes. Public safety requires more than new powers, new offences, or new enforcement tools. It requires governments to follow through on their commitments, invest in prevention, support vulnerable people, and ensure that the protections they announce are actually available to those who need them. As is often the case with omnibus legislation, this bill touches on a remarkably large range of subjects: adoption, sex offenders, police service boards, restraining orders, drug paraphernalia, administrative penalties for zoning violations, police records check, plea negotiations, firearms, towing, criminal harassment, and, notably, measures to implement protections for survivors of human trafficking. It is that latter issue that I want to address first, because I do have a special interest in this one. And I will begin with the Schedule 9 then, which addresses coerced deaths incurred by victims of human trafficking. This schedule finally provides the implementation measures for my private bills, Bill 41, the Protection from Coerced Deaths Incurred from Human Trafficking Act, a legislation that was co-sponsored by members of all parties in this House, that received unanimous support in this House, that proceeded through committee and received royal assent in December 2023. So that, Madam Speaker, was more than 2.5 years ago. The bill, Bill 41, everybody supported it, received royal assent 2.5 years ago, and it's still not available for survivors of human trafficking. And since then, I've continued to raise this issue with the Attorney General because the purpose of Bill 41 was straightforward but critically important. Human trafficking survivors are often forced, manipulated, or coerced into taking on debts in their own names. Traffickers compel victims to sign leases, obtain credit cards, take out loans, or incur other financial obligations through threats, violence, intimidation, and psychological control. And those debts, Madam Speaker, do not disappear when the trafficking ends. Instead, they remain with survivors as they attempt to rebuild their lives. They damage credit ratings, they prevent access to housing, they create barriers to employment, and they undermine financial independence for those victims. And they become yet another long-term control tool, even after a survivor has escaped exploitation. Bill 41 sought to address this injustice by creating a pathway for survivors to have those coerced debts legally recognized and erased from their record. Schedule 9 now establishes the review mechanism that will determine whether a debt was coerced and should be extinguished, while attempting to do so in a manner that avoids re-traumatizing survivors. And that's very, very important, Mr. Speaker. We don't want those victims, those survivors, to have to retell their stories and to try to convince a body that that debt does not belong to them. So I do appreciate the work that ultimately went into developing these provisions and create a process intended to protect survivors throughout the application process. But it is fair to ask why it took more than 2.5 years after royal assent for these protections to finally reach the implementation stage. During that time, survivors continued to carry debts they never freely incurred. They continued to face damaged credit, barriers to housing, barriers to employment, and the lingering financial consequences of exploitation. And I've talked to several of those survivors, Mr. Speaker, and the impact on their mental health is significant. When you get phone calls all the time, every day, about debts that are owed, but that you cannot reimburse and that you never got the benefit from. So for them, the delay was not simply administrative. It was deeply personal. Advocates have waited, communities have waited, but most importantly, survivors have waited and continued to suffer. The protections that were promised have not been available to the people who needed them the most. For that reason, the eventual implementation of these provisions will be more than a legislative milestone. For many survivors, it will be a long overdue opportunity to move forward. However, I do have some concerns regarding the proposed intervener framework. So the government has chosen to restrict eligible interveners organizations primarily to those receiving provincial funding. In my view, that approach is unnecessarily restrictive because an organization's ability to assist survivors should not depend exclusively on whether it receives provincial funding. There are many capable, experienced organizations across Ontario that could provide valuable support to survivors through this process. And restricting eligibility in this way risks creating the perception that maybe the government is favoring certain organizations while excluding others that may be equally qualified. And what we want is more of those organizations, not less. And currently, there is only Toronto Victim Services that's located in Toronto that appears to be one of the only organization positioned to undertake this role. But Speaker, the survivors do not only live in Toronto, they live in Ottawa, they live in Thunder Bay, they live in Parry Sound and Muskoka, they live in communities throughout Ontario. And so it's important that those services be available province-wide. We should ensure that the survivors across the province have access to organizations capable of supporting them through this process. Speaker, I also want to acknowledge the provisions in this bill that strengthen enforcement on restraining orders. This is an important tool, and these measures are important. For many victims of intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, harassment, and coercive control, restraining orders provide a critical layer of protection and peace of mind. These provisions will allow restraining orders issued elsewhere in Canada to be enforced in Ontario, and that will spare the victims from having to undertake additional legal proceedings simply to maintain protections that they already possess. And that matters because it removes barriers, it reduces stress, and it allows victims to focus on rebuilding their lives. For those reasons, we support this portion of the bill. But while there are useful reforms contained in Bill 119, I continue to find it very unfortunate that this government approaches public safety primarily through a reactive lens rather than a preventive one. Building safer communities requires more than expanding enforcement. It requires addressing the conditions that place people at risk in the first place. When people cannot access housing, mental health care, addiction treatment, victim support, or legal aid, those challenges do not disappear. They become more visible, and they become more visible in the places where the government is trying to avoid. So they become more visible in our streets, in our shelters, in our emergency rooms. and especially in our justice system. Prevention is not a soft approach to public safety. It's one of the most effective public safety strategies available to us. If we are serious about safer communities, then we must be equally serious about investing in prevention, early intervention, victim services, mental health supports, housing, and legal aid. Legislation that promises stronger enforcements and greater protections is not enough on its own. We must also ensure that the organizations charged with delivering those protections have the resources they need to succeed. And we must address the growing delays in our courts and tribunals that continue to prevent vulnerable Ontarians from obtaining timely access to justice. I also believe this legislation could have gone further. We should be reducing court backlog. We should be strengthening access to independent legal advice. And we should be improving supports for victims navigating the justice system. And some of this work could have been advanced through Lydia's Law, the private member's bill introduced by my colleague from Waterloo, which sought to strengthen support for survivors of sexual assaults. Unfortunately, the government chose not to support that legislation. So I must ask, where are the measures in Bill 119 that ensure survivors of sexual violence are receiving the support they deserve? Good public policy requires more than announcements. It requires sustained commitment, and it requires governments to follow through. Speaker, I also want to address the provisions relating to pill presses and the production of illegal drugs. No one in this House disputes that organized crime and illegal drug manufacturing pose serious dangers to communities across Ontario. The proliferation of toxic street drugs, particularly fentanyl and synthetic opioids, have devastated families in every region of this province. And I see those consequences in my own riding of Ottawa-Vanier to a scale that should be unacceptable to anyone. Communities are frightened, parents are worried for their children, and healthcare workers are simply exhausted. And far too many Ontarians have lost loved ones to overdose and poisoning. So I understand the government's desire to demonstrate action through stronger enforcement measures targeting illegal drug production. But again, enforcement alone will not solve the mental health and addiction crisis unfolding across Ontario. That is a fundamental weakness in this government's approach. We continue to see announcements focused on criminal enforcement while the underlying public health emergency remains inadequately addressed. And their reality is simple. People cannot access treatment, counseling, supportive housing when they need it. Municipalities and frontline organizations are carrying enormous burdens with insufficient provincial support. At the same time, the toxic supply continues to claim lives at an alarming rate that we can no longer ignore. So while the government emphasizes tougher measures on pill presses, Ontarians are asking a broader question. Where is the comprehensive strategy? Where is the meaningful investment in prevention, treatment, recovery, and mental health care? This government has closed safe consumption sites, places where overdoses could be reversed and where people could be connected to services. Safe consumption sites are not, by themselves, I totally acknowledge that, they're not the solution to the addiction crisis, but they remain an important component of harm reduction. Closing them without ensuring robust alternatives is simply irresponsible. And in my writing, organizations lost funding for harm reduction services, and they have proposed alternative models that would have preserved some kind of support, some level of support for vulnerable residents. Unfortunately, the province has shown very little interest in those proposals. Instead, we've been asked to accept assurances regarding the effectiveness of the Heart Hub model without being provided sufficient evidence to evaluate its success. I actually asked how the success of those Heart Hub was measured, and the response was that it's not actually being measured. So how do we know it's working? Heart Hubs may not be a complete replacement for safe consumption services, but they are certainly preferable to having no services at all. Yet many vulnerable communities, including communities in Ottawa-Vanier, have been left without a heart hub after safe consumption sites were forced to close. And I'm really, really concerned and scared about what this will mean as an impact in the community. Speaker, addiction is both a healthcare issue and a public safety issue. If we fail to treat it as both, we will continue cycling people through emergency rooms, shelters, police interactions, and the justice system without addressing the root cause of the crisis. Frontline workers have been sounding the alarm for years. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, outreach workers, mental health professionals, community organizations. Everybody realized we need to do something. They've all told us that Ontario's mental health and addiction system is under enormous strain. Yet, access to care remains deeply unequal depending on where someone lives, what resources they have, and whether they can afford private services. That is not a system meeting the needs of Ontarians. I worry that measures such as these allow governments to appear tough on crime without confronting the more difficult work of building a fully functioning mental health and addictions care system. Because real solutions require sustained investment. They require coordination across healthcare, housing, education, and community services. And they require political will beyond short-term announcements. Of course, illegal drug manufacturing must be addressed, and of course, organized criminal activity must be dismantled. But if we are serious about saving lives and improving public safety, we must invest with equal urgency in treatment, recovery, prevention, and mental health care. Otherwise, we are treating symptoms while ignoring the broader crisis unfolding around us. And Ontarians simply deserve better than that. Speaker, legislation alone does not protect people. Implementation protects people. Funding protects people. Accessible services protect people. And a justice system that people can actually navigate protects people. Bill 119 contains measures that move us in the right direction, and I welcome those improvements. But Ontario's most vulnerable residents deserve more than incremental progress. They deserve a government that acts with the urgency that is required, that follows through on its commitments, and invests in the supports that allow people not only to survive, but to rebuild their lives. When survivors of human trafficking are waiting for promised protections, when victims are struggling to navigate the justice system, and when communities continue to grapple with addiction and mental health crisis without adequate resources, our work is not finished. I hope this legislation will continue to improve through committee review and consultation with stakeholders, survivors, legal experts, and community organizations, because I believe it's possible to make this legislation stronger, to actually bring some real relief to the victims and survivors. Because when it comes to protecting vulnerable people and building safer communities, we have a responsibility not merely to do something, but to do the right thing. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions? Questions? I recognize the member from Waterloo.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the member from Ottawa-Vanier for really a detailed analysis of Bill 119, protecting Ontario streets and communities, and I also want to thank her for also speaking so strongly in support of Lydia's law last week, based on evidence, based on research, based on the facts of what's actually happening in our justice system here in Ontario. She referenced, this ongoing narrative that the Conservatives are tough on crime. To the member from Ottawa-Vanier, can you actually be tough on crime if your justice system fails victims and survivors of sexual assault?
I recognize the member from Ottawa-Vanier.
I want to thank the member from Waterloo for her question, but also for advocacy to protect vulnerable people, especially victims of sexual violence. And I think we care about a lot of the same thing, which is protecting vulnerable people, but also providing them with the services and the means to obtain justice. And being tough on crime doesn't mean anything for those survivors or those victims if they don't have access to services to help them just try to rebuild their lives, or if they don't have access to a justice system that will actually bring justice. It takes a lot of courage for those people to reach out and come forward and ask for help. And when that help is not available, it's beyond discouraging. It's like we're not showing them the compassion that they need, and that in a moment like they are, where they're at, it's really what is necessary. So being tough on crime doesn't mean anything if we don't address the underlying reasons why those criminals, act in the first place, but also the other side is the help for the victims and survivors. Thank you.
I recognize the member from Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And before I ask my question, I just want to congratulate my wonderful colleague from Ottawa-Vanier. It's not often that a private member's bill from the opposition helps shape government legislation. And what you did back in 2023, getting that bill to receive royal assent, I think is a wonderful thing, and it's unfortunate that it's taken this government years to finally start implementing it. But your work on protecting survivors of human trafficking from coarse debt is now being implemented through Bill 119. So can you tell us why this issue mattered so much to you and what this change will mean for survivors?
I recognize the member for Ottawa-Vanier.
Thank you to my colleague from Nepean for the questions and for acknowledging also the work that has been done to help survivors of human trafficking. It was a very, very long process. The bill itself, I introduced it once and then reintroduced it. But before I reintroduced it a second time, I did a lot of work to talk to a colleague across the aisle and get supports from all parties. Because I don't think it's not a partisan issue. Human trafficking is a real problem. And the solution that was advanced in my bill was a small part to help them, but it was meaningful, and that was to remove the coarse debts that they were plagued with that were preventing them, that are still preventing them actually from rebuilding their lives. And so I'm glad that finally the government has put in their legislation a mechanism to implement that policy, and it's not for lack of, trying to get it faster. I've been in the Attorney General face quite a number of times. I don't know how many times I raised that issue in the House.
Response? But
finally it's there, and I really, really hope that these measures will actually be implemented for real.
Thanks. I recognize the member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Thank you, Speaker, and thanks to the member for her comments and her work this afternoon. I wanted to ask her about access to information. I think it's really important for people in our communities to know what's in their communities, what's around their surroundings. Police already notify communities about high-risk offenders in their vicinity, but it's very disjointed, the information, and hard to access for people. And our proposed amendments in this legislation would establish a centralized province-wide website, similar to models used elsewhere, to enhance that transparency and support law enforcement, strengthen public awareness. I wanted to know the member's thoughts on that change contained in the bill.
The member for Ottawa-Vanier.
Thank you, and thank you to the member for this question. It's actually a provision that I read in the bill that I didn't have a problem with. I didn't really mention it during my notes because, those measures are good. But again, what I find unfortunate is that we're not attacking the problem where we need to. What we need to is, prevent people from becoming criminals in the first place. And it's not by building more jails and locking up people that we're going to address that issue. There are too many people that are desperate, that are on the streets, that have mental health issues, that have addictions, and they have nowhere to turn, and they often, have a recourse that's not acceptable to our community, and they become criminals. And of course, on that part, having more access to those, a registry of those people is a good thing. I don't have a problem with this part of the bill.
I recognize the member from Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Ottawa-Vanier for her remarks. I appreciated the support for strengthening protections against intimate partner violence, and while it seems that Bill 119 is an important step, many survivors, many advocates, families have told us that they need a stronger, more detailed protection. One example was Lydia's Law, legislation that the Ontario NDP brought forward to improve risk assessment, information sharing, accountability in cases where women are at high risks of violence. We're also seeing that, while the changes are welcome in allowing restraining orders from outside of Ontario to be enforced here, the bill does not seem to be able to make them more effective because victims are still going to be left without help when those orders are breached and at risk of being hurt or even killed. And I wondered if my colleague would like to speak to ways that we could improve that part of this bill, and perhaps the government would take those into consideration.
The member for Ottawa-Vanier.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Restraining orders are an important tool if they work and can be enforced. I've heard horror stories about, women being locked in their home, in their apartment, and having an abuser on the other side of the door trying to get in and really intimidating and terrorizing that person. And so restraining orders, if you don't have the resource to make sure that they can be implemented effectively, that there's enough police services to take care of them, is less meaningful. I find it's very important, going back to Lydia's laws, because the measures that were proposed in that private member's bill were so great, evidence-based. The government needs to understand what's happening in our court system. Needs to understand what the real numbers are and why people are not getting justice. Because if you don't understand what's not working, you can't fix it.
We have time for another a quick question and response. I recognize the member for Kingston and the Islands.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je voudrais demander à ma collègue de raconter une histoire ou peut-être un récit de sa circonscription pour montrer pourquoi la question de la protection des personnes vulnérables est si urgente.
The member for Ottawa-Vanier.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Vous savez, ce qui a été un déclencheur pour moi de décider de travailler sur le projet de loi pour les victimes de trafic humain, c'est parce que j'ai rencontré une des victimes qui a voulu me raconter son histoire et qui avait besoin d'aide. Et j'ai été vraiment touchée par l'authenticité des défis qu'elle rencontrait, et je me suis dit, il faut faire quelque chose, surtout quand j'ai appris que cette personne-là allait à la même école que mes enfants. Alors, ça m'a vraiment motivée à agir puis à faire quelque chose de concret. C'est pour ça que j'ai investi 2 ans de ma vie à travailler très fort pour être capable de proposer la législation, le projet de loi 41, qui a finalement passé et qui, j'espère, va être mis en œuvre après l'adoption de ce projet de loi-ci. Merci, Madame la Présidente.